Hello and welcome to another episode of Communication How. In these days, we have been dealing with certain traditions in communication theory. So far, we have dealt with the semiotic tradition, with the phenomenological tradition, the cybernetic tradition, the socio-cultural, and the socio-psychological tradition. Today, we shall take a look at another tradition. Today, we shall analyze the critical tradition, and in this way, we will be able to see how the critical tradition, in a way, does have an impact in our day to day life and also in our day to day dealings with others. So, without any further delay, let us enter into the critical tradition. So, basically, before we begin analyzing the critical tradition, we could do a small exercise, and that is, we could think about our privileges for a certain time. So, probably each and every one of you can ask yourself this question: what advantages and resources do you have at this point in your life? How did these come to you? What has happened in society for these particular assets to gain value or to be a resource that enables you to move forward in a healthy, self-fulfilling way, both as an individual and as a member of a community. At the same time, probably once you have analyzed and seen what privileges you have, okay, and once you have understood that these are privileges because these seem to be certain things that are accepted by the society in a way that enables you to move forward. At the same time, probably you can now take a look at the privileges of others. Okay, think for a few minutes about what privileges others have that you do not have. Why don't you have these? What stands in your way? After you have thought about the privileges that others have and you don't have, probably we can go to the next level. We could now think of a third set of questions that basically involves what special assets, abilities, resources, or skills do you possess that have not been recognized or valued in society? Why do these things remain unimportant to others? What symbols, rules, and meanings have emerged from communication within society? So, in this way, we can basically look at certain symbols, certain meanings that have emerged from our communication within society, that have given power to some groups and it has taken power from others. And in this way, we see if we take a look at all these assets, if we take a look at all these questions, we will basically realize that all this pertains to a particular field. Well, when it comes to the critical tradition, we can say that questions of privilege and power have assumed importance in the communication theory. And this tradition is thus called the critical tradition, because this is the tradition that basically deals with how power is vested, how power is sort of established and also even dominated in certain times through various means of communication. So, if you have a privilege or lack of it because of the color of your skin, because of your nationality, because of your language, religion, or your sexual orientation, or even because of your regional affiliation, your income level, or any other aspect of your identity, then you are facing the kind of social difference that assumes great importance to critical scholars. So basically, the scholars in this critical tradition are basically dealing with how these social differences that are there in society, these social differences because of various factors, okay, how these contribute to some getting privilege, how some assume the position of privilege, whereas others are sort of deprived of the same opportunity or of the same privilege. Now, these theories are basically concerned with how power, oppression, and privilege are the products of certain forms of communication throughout society. And as a result of it, we can say that all this, studying questions of power and privilege, studying how social differences play an important role in a person being privileged over the other, all these basically make the critical tradition significant in the field of communication theory today. Now we see that the critical tradition stands in opposition to many of the basic assumptions of other traditions. It is heavily influenced by work in Europe, by US feminism, and by postmodern and post-colonial discourses. Now we see that this tradition is growing in its popularity and impact on the communication theory. And in this way, we see that throughout the world, there are people suffering from different kinds of injustice, different kinds of oppression. Of late, we have seen these issues are beginning to come to light. And therefore, this shows us why this critical tradition is very important, especially for us in order to understand how communication processes in a way strengthen these kind of oppressions or these kind of certain structures which sort of lead to injustice and oppression. So more of that we will deal when we look at certain key ideas of the critical tradition. Now, although there are several varieties of critical tradition, it is said that all share three essential features. And the first of this is the critical tradition seeks to understand the taken for granted systems, power structures, beliefs, or ideologies that dominate society with a particular eye to whose interests are served by those power structures. So basically, we see that the emphasis of this is to look at certain things which we tend to take for granted when it comes to analyzing certain power structures. And here they try to see that whenever a policy has been introduced, whenever a policy has been implemented, whose interests are being met? Is it the interest of the people who are in need of it, or is somebody else basically gaining from the whole policy? Next, we also see that there are certain questions, okay, such as who does and who does not get to speak, what does and what does not get said, and who stands to benefit from a particular system. These are the type of questions asked by the critical theorists. Sometimes we see that there is a control on what can be said and what cannot be said. There is also a control on the medium that is being used. And all these, in a way, lead to a certain degree of oppression. They lead to a certain level of injustice being created because certain things which are created tend to serve others more than the deserving ones. Secondly, we see that critical theorists are also particularly interested in uncovering oppressive social conditions and power arrangements, which, in order to promote emancipation or a freer or more fulfilling society. So in this way, we see that the critical theorists, they are basically interested in trying to discover what is it that basically creates these conditions of inequality, what creates these conditions of oppression, and how certain people who are oppressed, certain people who are not free, how can they be liberated? How can they be emancipated? And therefore, we see that understanding oppression is the first step to dispelling the illusions of ideology and taking action to overcome oppressive forces. And thus, we see that these critical theorists work in this fashion in order to discover various trends and how these are also very important for setting people free from oppression. Now we see that the third critical theory, okay, or when we look at the third point, we can basically say that critical theory makes a conscious attempt to fuse theory and action. Now, such theories are clearly normative and they act to accomplish change in the conditions that affect society. So in this way, we see that the critical research aims to reveal the ways in which competing interests clash and the manner in which these interests or conflicts are resolved in the favor of particular groups over other ones. And in this way, we see that the critical theories frequently ally themselves with the interest of the marginalized groups. And when we look at the aims of critical researchers, first and foremost, we see that they want to reveal ways in which competing interests clash, how the interests between two groups, how do these interests normally come to one another, how they compete with one another, and what happens when there is a clash of interest. Next, we also see that they also try to see how conflicts tend to get resolved in the favor of a particular group, how laws are also there in favor of a particular group. Now, as we said, that critical theory tries to fuse theory and action, which means it tries to make stuff practical. It doesn't leave things only to the theological or the theoretical pattern, but it also looks at the practical aspects of it. And therefore, we see that critical theories tend to ally themselves with the interests of the marginalized groups. In the field of communication, we see that critical scholars are particularly interested in how messages reinforce oppression in society. Now, we see that the way a particular message is being reinforced, the particular way in which a message is sent across, it could reinforce oppression in certain ways. And therefore, we see that it's very important to pay attention to what we communicate and how we communicate. Also, the ways, the means in which we communicate certain things could be oppressive towards others. Sometimes unknowingly, we may do certain things, but in the end, it could lead to oppression for the others. And therefore, at the same time, we also see that critical scholars are interested in social action. They focus on discourse and the texts that promote particular ideologies, establish and maintain power, and subvert the interests of certain groups and classes. In a way, if you look at the critical discourse analysis, we see that this critical discourse analysis looks at actual features of texts that manifest these oppressive arrangements without separating communication from other forms in the overall system of oppressive forces. So when it tries to look at the entire system, when it tries to look at the oppressive arrangement, it does not separate communication from the other factors, because it does see communication as one of the ways through which oppression could be permeated, or through which it could be sort of even enticed or ignited. At the same time, we also see, because critical theories are so broad and because they cast such a wide net, they are often hard to place and categorize within the overall body of communication theory. And therefore now it is very important in order to look at some of the salient features of the critical tradition. So we have basically seen that how in the critical tradition, we tend to look at certain things with regards to how certain structures of oppression are sort of permeated or encouraged because of certain ways in which things are communicated. And therefore, when we look at the salient features of critical tradition, we will see that critical scholars investigate how power, oppression, and privilege are the products of certain forms of communication throughout society. We also see that it is heavily influenced by the work in Europe by US feminist and queer scholars and by postmodern and post-colonial discourses. At the same time, we see that the critical tradition seeks to understand the taken for granted systems, power structures, and beliefs that dominate society. It looks at these beliefs, these power structures, in a particular eye to see whose interests are served by the power structures. And we see that the critical theorists are particularly interested in uncovering oppressive social conditions and power arrangements in order to promote emancipation and liberation of the people. Now, at the same time, when we look at these critical theories, we see that Marxism is considered the source of contemporary critical theory. Why? Now, Marx, in what is called as the critique of political economy, thought that the means of production in society determines the nature of society. And so the economy is the basis of all social structure. Similarly, he also said that in capitalistic systems, it is profit that drives production. And it is a process that ends up oppressing labor or the working classes. I think a perfect example of this would basically be how cheap labor is found in certain developing countries. And therefore, big industries, in the bid to sort of reduce their production cost, in the bid to increase profits, would basically send their goods to these developing countries to be assembled, so that since the cost of production there becomes less, they are able to gain more profit. But once again, we see who is oppressed. They are the workers who are oppressed because they have to do sometimes double the work for half the salary. And therefore, we see that how all these means of production, as Marx said, in capitalistic systems, since the production is driven by profit, it tends to oppress the working class and the laborers. At the same time, we see that communication practices are also seen as the outcome between individual creativity and social constraints on creativity. So, liberation will occur only when individuals are truly free to express themselves with clarity and reason. So here it is said that language is also an important constraint on individual expression, because language of the dominant class defines and perpetuates that oppression, making it difficult for the working class groups to fully understand their situations and to discover the means to achieve emancipation. And therefore, we see that it is the language of the dominant class, the rules that are made, which in certain ways do not prevent those who are oppressed to seek for emancipation. And therefore, we see that if we look at these theories carefully, we see that the critical theorists basically try to look at the emancipation and the freedom of these people. At the same time, we also see there are feminist and queer theories, which are examples of the critical tradition, because both critique gender with the eye to transforming gender relationships. And therefore, as we have said, language plays an important constraint on individual expression. And therefore, the language of the dominant class would probably define and perpetuate oppression. So at the same time, we also see that in the bid of transforming gender relationships, we see that these feminist and queer theories, okay, play an important part in the critical tradition, because they critique what is currently happening in society. Because we know that the language of the dominant class defines and perpetuates oppression. And since we see that most people from the LGBT community do face a lot of oppression, a lot of discrimination, there are now groups that are moving forward. They are critiquing the current system and thus making it possible for the others in order to get more freedom to live their lives according to their will. So therefore, we see that rather than a fixed, static, and rigid construction, these scholars describe gender in fluid and always evolving terms, offering possibilities for emancipation to previously oppressed social groups. So in a way, we see that this is all that we have for the critical tradition, which basically looks at how oppression is being done in society. And having seen the oppression, they try to uncover the various forms, the various sources of this oppression, the various reasons for it. And also they look at how communication does play a major part, especially language. So that is all for the critical tradition. In the next time around, we shall take a look at another tradition, mainly the rhetorical tradition, a tradition which is very important for each and every one of us as we use it almost every day and at every moment. So till then, thank you.